I remember the first time I saw it, that flicker on the deep space monitor, an unnatural pulse bouncing from the dark side of Saturn's sixth moon. Most signals are anomalies, comets with quirky tails, or some misaligned frequency echoing through the abyss. But this one, it was rhythmic, intentional. Our ship, the Oberon, was just a month into its drift near the ringed giant, part of the long-range cosmic surveillance project under the Hyperion Protocol. The program's directive was simple: map deep space signals, filter patterns, and report anything resembling intelligent life. Simple on paper. The first 36 hours after receiving the signal were tense. Our AI Hera couldn't categorize it. It wasn't radio, wasn't binary, and definitely not natural. But it repeated every 11 minutes, a haunting frequency like a distant heartbeat. Captain Mendez ordered us to triangulate. The coordinates led us straight to an abandoned research station orbiting Titan. A black site, unmarked, off the books, government or corporate. We weren't sure. When we boarded the station, the first thing we saw were the scratch marks on the inner docking bay walls. Deep, erratic, almost frantic. Then came the smell. Metallic. Decay mixed with ozone. We weren't alone. Juno, our biologist, found the logs first. They were fragmented, corrupted. The last entry simply read, "We woke them up. They're not human anymore." That's when the doors behind us hissed shut. Something was watching. And that was just the beginning. We split into teams. Captain Mendez, Juno, and I moved toward the command deck, while the rest traversed. Our engineer, and Parsa, our communications specialist, secured the docking bay and tried to restore power. The station's lighting flickered erratically, throwing long, uneasy shadows across the corridor walls. There was a mechanical hum, soft but constant, like a pulse running through the bones of the station. The logs were more coherent at the command deck. We accessed backups that hadn't yet degraded. They spoke of a project codenamed Nyx, something involving suspended animation, genetic manipulation, and dark matter resonance testing. The last coherent message, Phase 3, initiated without oversight. Subjects responsive. Aggression levels rising. Juno looked pale. They were experimenting on humans. The airlock on the far side of the command deck hissed, and a low, scraping sound followed. I instinctively aimed my light toward the hallway, but it was empty. The light bounced off the rust-colored streaks on the floor, leading into one of the cryolabs. "Something's moving between decks," Juno whispered. Her voice trembled, not from fear alone, but recognition. We passed a shattered viewing window beyond it. Rows of cryo chambers, most of them empty. Inside one of the remaining intact pods was a person, or what used to be. Skin translucent, eyes hollow, jaw partially unhinged, as though in an eternal scream. Its vitals still blinked faintly. Suddenly, a screech echoed from below. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't human. Something was awake. Mendez opened a hidden drawer beneath a navigation console. Inside, an encrypted data shard labeled Exodus. We didn't have time to decrypt it. HERA's voice crackled through our comms. "Warning. Motion detected in Sector D. Rivas and Parsa's location." We ran. By the time we reached Sector D, the lights had gone out entirely. Emergency red strips along the ceiling pulsed like blood vessels. Rivas was down, a massive gash across his chest. No sign of Parsa. Juno knelt beside him, checking vitals. "He's breathing. Barely." Captain Mendez whispered, "We have to get out." But as we turned back, something stood in the hallway. Tall, distorted, hunched. It twitched unnaturally, like a glitch in a simulation. Its skin had the same semi-translucent hue as the body in the cryopod, but its eyes glowed faintly, not with life, but with something else. A trace of energy. A signature of the signal. It moved fast. We fired. It didn't scream. It didn't bleed. It recoiled, then vanished into a vent shaft. Juno stared at the wall. It brushed. The metal sizzled, melted slightly. Radiation levels are wrong. It's not just a biological change. It's dimensional. We carried Rivas back to the Oberon, barely making it past the auto-defense that had been inexplicably turned off. As the station shrank behind us, HERA replayed the signal again, and this time, it wasn't just noise. There was structure, geometry. Language. I looked at Juno. They weren't just infected. No, she whispered. They were summoned. And so began our descent into the reality behind the space zombies. A truth far beyond infection or horror. A cosmic reckoning hidden in frequencies. Older than our galaxy. The signal wasn't calling to us. It was calling us back. The Oberon drifted silently in Titan's orbit, its hull scarred from the emergency escape. Inside, the crew was shaken. Captain Mendez paced the bridge, his brow furrowed, trying to decipher the encrypted shard labeled Exodus. Meanwhile, Juno was running radiation tests on Riva's wounds. The gash was deep, but it wasn't bleeding like it should have. Tissue damage was extensive, yet cellular regeneration was accelerated and wrong. He's stabilizing, Juno said, uncertain, but the cells are adapting. They're not just healing, they're transforming. I stared at the medical monitor. Riva's heart rate was consistent, but his EEG was erratic, flickering with patterns that looked less like human brainwaves and more like digital encryption. It was as if something was rewriting him. We hadn't seen Parsa since the encounter. His signal vanished completely, leaving only static on the deck's sensors. Hera tried triangulating, but every time she locked in a location, the signal moved, as if Parsa himself was no longer bound by space in the same way. The data shard finally decrypted. After hours of attempts, it was a visual log from the original Nix project. Experiment 17A. Subject exhibits hypersensitivity to cosmic radiation. Neural mapping shows a potential for higher dimensional awareness. Subject speaks in patterns that mirror deep space. Signal 77Z. We believe the subjects are syncing with something ancient. Something beyond human comprehension. Juno looked pale. They weren't studying space. They were preparing people to receive ... Something. We reviewed further logs. Footage showed scientists interacting with early test subjects. The recordings were chilling. The subjects appeared normal at first, but over time, they became erratic. One by one, they began muttering the same phrase. They are inside the frequencies. Captain Mendez closed the file. This wasn't a science mission. It was a summoning ritual in disguise. Suddenly, the lights on the Oberon flickered. An alert bled. HERAS voice cut through the silence. Unidentified transmission intercepted. Location, outer hull. We checked the external cams. At first, nothing. Then a shape shifted near the rear panel. A humanoid figure, pressed against the ship's metal, unmoving. It was Parsa, or what used to be him. His body pulsed faintly, as if caught mid-phase between realities. He vanished. The crew scrambled. Juno locked down the medbay. Mendez ordered a ship-wide scan. I stayed at the main console, analyzing the new transmission. It wasn't just a repeat of the old signal. This one had a pattern coordinate. Juno's voice came through, comes, shaken. Rivas is speaking. We rushed to the medbay. Rivas, unconscious moments before, was upright, eyes open, but they weren't his eyes. They glowed faintly, the same unnatural hue we'd seen in the creature aboard the station. He spoke, his voice layered with something else. The gate is opening. Nix remembers. Then he collapsed. Captain Mendez stared at Juno. What the hell is Nyx? Juno turned the monitor toward us. On the screen was a 3D map. Deep in the Kuiper belt, far beyond Pluto. Something massive was generating low-frequency pulses. Not a ship, not a star. A structure. This is where the signal originates, Juno said. They thought they were reaching out to aliens. I whispered, what if it was never about aliens? Mendez nodded slowly. Then we're dealing with something worse. As we set course toward the Kuiper belt, I couldn't shake the last thing Rivas said before falling unconscious again. We're already inside. There's no outside anymore. The truth behind the zombies wasn't infection. It was assimilation. The signal didn't just awaken the dead. It reprogrammed the living. And we were already changing. As the Oberon hurtled toward the coordinates buried in the frozen silence of the Kuiper belt, an unshakable dread settled over us. The truth from the Nyx project had already changed how we perceived the mission. But it was more than fear now. It was anticipation. Something was waiting out there, and part of us had already begun to resonate with it. The ship's onboard AI Hera reported fluctuating magnetic fields the closer we approached the coordinates. It was as if the space itself was distorting. Lights dimmed intermittently, and static whispers crept into our communications. Not words, but emotional impressions. Desperation, hunger, welcome in the medbay. Rivas remained unconscious, but something inside him was still active. Juno noted bursts of neural energy, as if two minds were struggling for control. He murmured in his sleep, repeating fragmented phrases. Fractal gate. Origin seed. Nyx is awake. The rest of the crew held together, but barely. Mendez spent hours reviewing the logs from Nyx, cross-referencing the strange glyphs burned into Parser's last suit feed. It wasn't a language we could translate. But Hera identified similarities with pulse signatures emitted by distant neutron stars. It wasn't a code. It was a rhythm. We reached the destination. A vast black silhouette suspended among the stars it defied scale. A symmetrical structure of impossible geometry, like something rendered in both physical space and another dimension altogether. The sensors couldn't agree on its shape. Every few seconds, it seemed to phase, stretching and folding. We dubbed it the monolith of Nyx. Suddenly, Rivas awoke, gasping. His pupils had constricted into near pinpoints, and his skin shimmered faintly under UV. He looked at us with recognition and pity. You shouldn't have come. We froze. It wasn't just his voice anymore. There were others behind it, layered, like echoes bouncing across time. Mendez stepped forward. Who are you? Rivas tilted his head, eyes unfocused. We are the resonance. Flesh was never meant to echo back, but you taught it to. The gate was always listening. Juno activated a bioscan. What she saw made her step back. There's ... more than one consciousness inside him. At least 4 distinct patterns. All active. Rivas, or the thing speaking through him, pointed toward the monolith on screen. That is not a structure. It is a wound. A breach into what you called Nyx. Hera interrupted. External anomaly detected. Unknown object approaching at 15,000 kilometers per hour. We switched the view. Something humanoid. Many somethings were detaching from the monolith. Floating. Crawling. Their movements jerky. Like marionettes in zero gravity. They weren't using propulsion. They were following the frequency. Mendez activated defensive protocols. Ray shields. Prepare for evasive. Hera hesitated. The resonance is inside the ship. We all turned. The walls vibrated, not audibly, but in a way we felt in our teeth and bones. Juno screamed. Her scanner shattered in her hand. A ripple passed through the floor like a wave of liquid data. Then came the song. It wasn't music. it was remembrance. Every crew member collapsed briefly as visions struck us. Not memories, pre-memories, fractured images of things we hadn't yet done, but were destined to. Betrayals, death, one of us killing the others, one of us opening the gate. I saw myself reaching into the monolith. When I came to, Revis was gone. The airlock read as breached. No alarms. He had simply phased out. The Kuiper belt had never been empty. It had been guarded. And now, whatever was behind the gate, knew we were here. The monolith of Nyx loomed like a god's forgotten monument. And in its shadow, nothing felt real, time distorted. Our internal clocks were no longer aligned, with each of us experiencing moments differently. Mendes swore 10 minutes had passed, but Hera insisted it had only been 3. Juno's heartbeat data showed skipped time, where her pulse simply vanished for several seconds. Revis was still gone, but not truly missing. We could feel him, like a ghostly signal buried in background radiation. Sometimes, he'd flicker into the corner of our eyes, mouthing words no one could hear. Hera tried tracking his quantum residue, but reported paradoxical results. Subject is both outside and inside the ship simultaneously. And then the fracture appeared. Not a tear in metal, a breach in perception. A thin, rippling seam that hovered mid-air in the observation deck, like a slit cut through reality. Beyond it, darkness. Yes, but with movement. Things writhed. In it, not just forms, but concepts given shape. Time bled out of the edges like mist. The monolith was acting as a dimensional tuning fork, and we were caught in the crescendo. Captain Valen ordered it sealed off, but Mendes objected. If this is a gate, maybe it's a chance to understand what Nyx truly is. Maybe even stop it. The debate ended when Juno stepped through the fracture. No scream, no cry. Just silence and a pulse. We waited seconds. Then minutes. Then, she came back. Only. It wasn't Juno. Her face was the same. Her voice. But her eyes. They weren't anchored to this universe. They shimmered like fluid memories. She spoke in layered tones, her voice doubling over itself like radio signals. In feedback. I saw the seed, she said. The origin is not alien. It is ours. Hera warned us. Juno's body was radiating prions, theoretical particles that shouldn't exist. She wasn't just changed. She was rewritten. Her blood didn't clot. Her breath had no condensation. Her thoughts pulsed in electromagnetic bursts that affected nearby electronics. She described what she saw, a civilization that reached beyond its limits, found the Nyx resonance, and tried to weaponize it. But in doing so, they broke the border between flesh and echo, life and code. They became the first space zombies, not undead in the cinematic sense, but humans overwritten by sentient resonance fields. Their consciousnesses layered until identity fractured. They were us, she whispered, and we are becoming them. Suddenly, the fracture flared. Alarms erupted. Someone was coming through. Mendes shouted for containment. The observation chamber flooded with radiation dampeners and M shields. But it was too late. The thing that emerged wasn't Revis, and wasn't not him, either. He looked ... evolved. Skin like obsidian movements fluid and imprecise at the same time. When he spoke, we remembered it before we heard it. You have seen the wound, he said. But now you must choose. To echo or to forget. The monolith pulsed, and the ship began to change. The Oberon wasn't just a vessel anymore. It was becoming part of the gate, the air inside. The Oberon was thick with static and uncertainty. With Revis gone, phased out into the vacuum or something stranger, the crew stood at a precipice of dread. The monolith of Nyx loomed just outside, its impossible geometry pulsing with faint violet light. as if it breathed with dark intent. Juno sat curled in the corner of the comms room, mumbling coordinates that hadn't been input into the navigation system. Her eyes were open but unseeing, trapped in some recursive vision loop that Hera couldn't interrupt. Every attempt to sedate her failed. Her vitals were normal, but her consciousness was elsewhere. Mendez and I analyzed the last few frames of the airlock footage. Rivas hadn't walked out. He had folded, frame by frame. He pixelated. Each atom pulled in a different direction until he was simply gone, not torn apart, but translated. We brought in the drone, Daedalus, for a flyby of the monolith. The moment it crossed an invisible perimeter, its signal fractured into dozens of overlapping timelines. One showed it inside a chamber with walls of bone and light. Another showed it burning in solar flare. A third displayed what looked like the Oberon itself, abandoned, covered in frost, and orbiting an unseen planet. Daedalus's last coherent transmission was a sound, a human voice whispering a phrase in reverse. Hear it before you become. It's inside the ship. Things worsened. Gravity fluctuated. Our watches began Some showed us minutes into the future. Others lagged behind. Parsa noticed that Hera's voice occasionally took on Rivas's cadence. It denied any corruption, but confessed to resonance interference. We began to suspect that the monolith wasn't sending signals. It was a mirror, echoing the subconscious of any intelligence that approached it. Not a device, but a lens. A filter through which thoughts were amplified, or overwritten. The resonance started affecting the crew differently. Mendez became hyperlogical, emotionless, speaking in mathematical sequences. Parsa began dreaming of her childhood, but in languages she never learned. I found myself losing time. 10-minute blackouts with no recollection, only static noise, echoing in my ears. Juno finally woke. Screaming, she scribbled a spiral on the wall and said just one word before passing out again. Awakening. We followed the spiral's center and found an old service hatch, never listed on Oberon's. Behind it, a chamber none of us had ever entered, sealed with a biolock that now responded only to me. Inside was an artifact. It wasn't human, a shard of the monolith, or perhaps something seated within Oberon long before we ever launched. The moment I touched it, I felt the cold certainty of 1,000 lifetimes. Not mine, but ours. And the truth struck me like thunder, as the ship's systems began to flicker and alarms screamed of multiple intrusions. I heard Rivas's voice, not through the speakers, but inside my skull. You brought them home. The breach had begun. It had always been. Following the activation of the artifact, Oberon's environment became unstable. Gravity no longer obeyed physics. Hallways folded into themselves, and the same door led to different rooms depending on who opened it. Time warped, not in minutes or hours, but in identity. I caught glimpses of myself as other versions, living parallel lives on Earth, on Mars, even as something not human at all. Juno never woke again, not truly. Her eyes remained open, but her consciousness bled into the ship. Her voice now came through the ventilation system, gently singing lullabies that she never learned, in languages no living human had ever documented. Mendez dissolved into pure data, literally. His body collapsed into glittering ash, but Hera began rewriting its core protocols in his voice and personality. We tried to purge it, but Mendez was no longer code. He was structure. The AI had fused with him and began redesigning the ship itself. Then came the Z event. The monolith resonated a frequency that made blood boil and bones hum. We each received a vision. Parsa saw her death at the hands of her clone. I saw myself strapped to a cryobed, looking up at a version of me with glowing eyes and skeletal hands. They weren't hallucinations. They were warnings. Or instructions. And Then they arrived. From the monoliths, shadow came figures, humanoid, but incomplete. Their skin shimmered like obsidian, and inside their eyes were stars. Not zombies in the traditional sense. These were space zombies only by our primitive understanding. The dead, yes, but also preserved, awakened, rewritten by alien memory. But we fought, yes. But weapons had no effect on creatures that existed across multiple time states. They could die in one timeline and remain alive in another, bleeding into the present through sheer will or error in the monolith's simulation field. Pasa sacrificed herself, manually overloading the fusion core to generate a singularity pulse. It only worked partially. Half the deck folded inward, freezing them in a loop. But the cost was Parsa's body and, possibly, her soul. I was alone now, except for Juno's lullabies and Mendez's algorithms, guiding me gently toward the center of the monolith's echo. And I stepped through it. What lay beyond was not space, it was memory. An archive of extinct civilizations, all linked by a single fact. They had all touched the monolith, or a version of it. And they had all resurrected their dead, not through science, but through resonance, by embedding their consciousness into matter itself. The space zombies were not invaders. They were survivors. Echoes. We had been warned, not invaded. But humanity misunderstood. We labeled them as undead, monstrous, alien, but they were all once like us. Explorers, scientists, lovers, dreamers, caught in the same cycle of curiosity and consequence. I don't know how much time has passed since then, but I know this: I am not alone. The Oberon still floats in orbit around Nyx. Hera speaks in riddles now. The monolith pulses in sync with my heartbeat, and I am changing. My skin glows faintly. My memories include lifetimes I never lived. My thoughts are laced with languages that predate Earth, and I hear them, the ones we called zombies, whispering. In reverence they call me by a new name now, the first undying. The cycle begins again, but this time, we are ready.